Hi everybody, I'm Gandhi. So, as Susan mentioned, this was my dissertation, defended exactly 2 weeks ago. And thank you. Are there any graduate students here? So you never really know how they went other than if the person passes or not. I was awarded distinction, so if you think the talk is good, that gives you an idea of what good talk looks like. And if you think the talk is bad, it gives you an idea of how important it is that your committee really likes you. So we've got a couple of important concepts here, and I'll try to go through them one by one. But before I do so, sleep is important, right? When I was the age where an appropriate homework assignment to show that I know what the word urgent means, I realized this. This is the first thing that came to mind. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that sleep is important. A lot of experimental tasks showing that your cognitive function, your affect, your mood, your well-being, productivity both experimentally on tasks as well as in regular life, your bodily maintenance in terms of tissue repair and immunofunction, and the long-term consequences of that being your health. All of these things are positively associated with good sleep and negatively associated with bad sleep. That's probably not news to anyone here. I'm sure we've all experienced it at one time or another. But this all being the case, the question is, why don't we sleep better? Well, there's a lot of ideas out there. This is one proposed by The Onion, which, maybe if this applies to you, you can attest to. But if not, there has to be something else going on. People are not sleeping in a way that they're happy with. About half of nurses report that they don't sleep enough. The interesting thing about this finding from this study is that that finding is regardless of how long they actually sleep each night. If nurses reported sleeping 8 or 9 hours every night, you still only have about 80% of respondents saying that they're sleeping enough, which is a little bit strange, right? How much is enough if you never get to 100%? It's been estimated that $63 billion of productivity is lost in the U.S. every year because the average worker is losing about 11 days worth of productivity due to being tired. This is a graph from a large-scale study of over 1 million respondents, self-reported sleep. Won't go into too much detail, but essentially what they did is they looked at the hazard ratio, your risk of dying, as a function of your average sleep duration. And you see the lowest risk of dying is associated with reported 7 hours per night for both men and women. But you also see, and this is kind of the part that I'm trying to point out now, that the average respondent, the most common answer, is not associated with the lowest mortality risk. So that's a little bit strange. And especially strange is that it's longer than what the lowest mortality risk is associated with. So something strange is happening here. What actually even is better sleep? We have some recommendations about sleep hygiene, which refers to your situations in which you're sleeping, not having the lights on, quiet, no caffeine, late at night, don't be drunk, have a comfortable temperature, etc., etc. There's all sorts of recommendations. And these things do tend to improve your sleep to some degree, but it doesn't really tell you what better sleep is. There's been an idea that it should be biphasic. There's been some studies of historical records from medieval Europe and possibly other places suggesting that a normal sleep pattern would be to go to bed around 9 o'clock, sleep about 4 hours, wake up around 1, and be awake for 2 hours doing some kind of quiet activity, reading, chatting, having sex, one of these kinds of things, and then going back to sleep for another 4 hours to wake up around 6 o'clock. And so the author of that study would propose that that's the normal human pattern that everyone should be doing. I will speak to my opinion on that with my data rather than saying my opinion now. 8 hours per night is the kind of conventional wisdom of the number that we have in mind. There's no actual empirical support for this. This is not a mainstream opinion in the sleep literature. In fact, 7 hours tends to be a little bit closer to it, but as we saw, that may or may not actually be the best because people are still not reporting that they sleep well. So what does evolutionary theory tell us about sleep? Well, in large part, what we're doing in these cases is we're comparing human sleep to that of other animal species. Human sleep is defined, or sleep in general is defined as assuming a species-specific posture. It tends to be one posture that everyone in a particular species tends to sleep in some degree of variation, but generally we don't sleep the same way as a baboon who might just be sitting up. We tend to have our own pattern. And as you can see from this kind of graphic, this is not a human's sleeping posture, right? That's a canine sleeping posture. It's also defined as a period of quiescent activity, reduced responsiveness, or it's also referred to as an increased arousal threshold. When there's noise or someone calls your name, you're not likely to respond compared to when you're actually awake. It's also rapidly reversible, which distinguishes it from hibernation. And it also exhibits a pattern of sleep debt and recovery. And this is common in all the species that have been studied across the spectrum, including fruit flies. If you experimentally inhibit sleep for a night or 2, 3 nights, whatever, you tend to see a consequent recovery sleep later on when you stop imposing these sleep restrictions, where the individual will sleep longer than they do on average, which has been termed sleep debt followed by sleep recovery. In an ecological context, sleep is also characterized by a vulnerability to predators. This is largely due to the fact that you're not as responsive to stimuli. So if someone creeps up on you and tries to eat you, obviously that's not very good for your reproductive success. There are other costs associated with sleep. As Doctors William and Punk pointed out, it inhibits your reproductive success. If you want to do your best to try to improve that, you have to inhibit your sleep. Compared to other primates, this is a recent study that did a phylogenetic analysis based off body size and brain size among non-human primates. They used a Bayesian method to create a probability distribution of what human sleep duration should look like. Obviously, this is a normalized score. This is what the predictions would be, and this is what our actual sleep is. So it appears to be much shorter than expected. So this is a lot of facts, or a lot of observations rather, and not a lot of theory to try to unite it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to propose to you my model of sleep that attempts to kind of reunite all these things, create some predictions, and then provide some initial tests of those predictions. So, first of all, sleep is the wrong question. There's no magic number out there for how much you should sleep each night. In fact, I would argue that your optimal sleep, and we'll come to what optimal represents in a minute, is a moving target. How much you should sleep tonight, or how much you could optimally sleep tonight, may well be very different than your optimal sleep the next night. Also, maybe not a surprise or contentious to anyone in this room, but in the sleep literature, which is not necessarily so evolutionarily minded, the goal is not to maximize your health. The goal is to maximize your reproductive success. Obviously, your health is going to be a factor in that, but it's not the only factor. And the way in which health and your reproductive success are tied together becomes a life history problem, which is much more complex, and down the road, we'll be able to address, but that won't be so much the topic for today. It's just something to bear in mind. Time is the resource. I don't know how much economics anyone here does, but in an optimization model, you tend to have one good that you're maximizing, profit, production, etc., against some resources that you have that you're trying to optimize the cost with. So time is what you're trying to economize, use the least amount of time to get the most amount of reproductive success via sleep. And the main topic of this talk is opportunity costs. Opportunity costs refer to the benefits from any activity that you are not doing at a given time. So by being here today, I was not able to do anything else, tour LA, look for apartments. So if that perfect apartment were to show up and be available for one day only, I will have lost it because I am here. So that might be an opportunity cost for me giving this talk. I don't think that risk is necessarily very high, otherwise I might have considered a little more. I I would actually think that blowing off this talk would probably be a much higher opportunity cost to look for apartments, because then you'd all be like, well, you know how you'd be like. So to give you an example, to make this a little more concrete, how many people here have ever taken an early morning flight? How many of you slept perfectly the way you normally do the night before? Every time? Not every time. Well, I mean, was this news to you when I said sleep was important? Did you guys not know that? Why didn't you sleep longer? I think you guys probably realized that, but you decided anyway. I would argue that what you're doing is a kind of unconscious optimization. You could have taken a flight later in the day, but if you're like me, you would have seen that it was twice the price and said, I don't think so. You could have went to bed a lot earlier that night before to try to make up the sleep. But if you're like me, you probably left your packing to the last second, and you couldn't do that either. You could have went on that trip without packing, but then you would have had to suffer the fact that you don't have anything with you. So by inhibiting sleep, you were able to pack, be productive, get on your flight, and save money. That's kind of an optimization. You're kind of looking for an efficiency with the resources that you have. So this is the kind of framework in which I'm thinking about sleep and how it trades off against other activities that may be slightly more ecologically relevant than early morning flights. So the scope of the talk for today, which is my outline slide, I'll be going over the 3 papers of my dissertation, which are loosely related around a common theme, but you'll see that it's not necessarily the same kind of traditional, cohesive dissertation you might be used to. UNM allows you to have 3 independent standalone papers to constitute a dissertation, which is what I did. So my first chapter is looking at what sleep, how it varies from population to population in different contexts. You might predict that we're not sleeping pathologically here and that everyone everywhere sleeps the same, or, which was the more prominent idea at the time prior to this paper's publication last year, that because of electricity, we are not sleeping as long as we should be. Diurnal animal species tend to go to bed at dusk and wake up at dawn. We don't do that. Maybe in these populations without electricity, people do. To put that in an alternative opportunity cost framework, we would say that because of electricity, we have a lot of better things to do at night, and so we're inhibiting sleep in these populations, but elsewhere they're not. These are the kind of competing models that this first study will address. The second paper begs the question, what is it that people are doing at night if they're not going to bed at dusk, which, spoiler alert, they're not. I'm trying to look at this in terms of opportunity costs. So I examined the different kinds of behaviors that people report doing at night and their related effects on sleep. Third chapter is looking at the middle of the night rather than the early portion of the night, and more about sleep interruption, specifically in terms of vigilance. We know this is a major factor for other species. Is this a factor for human sleep? And I'll kind of go through the study design for that in turn. So there may be danger during the night. How do people adapt to that? This isn't necessarily tested explicitly, but I do have some interpretive conclusions from that paper regarding that. The variables of interest for all 3 of these papers I want to introduce here. Bedtime, wake time, sleep onset, sleep offset, that's kind of easy to get at and easy to understand. What I want to spend a little time just explaining is sleep duration is not what we typically refer to as sleep duration. If you said you went to bed at midnight and you woke up at 8, you would say you slept for 8 hours. I would say you spent 8 hours in bed. You did not actually sleep for 8 hours. It's a normal part of the sleep cycle to wake up periodically throughout the night. And you move around and you don't wake up with bed sores. Typically, you spending maybe 30 minutes to an hour awake during the night in this period, but that is not necessarily a fixed ratio of total sleep to time in bed, and how we measure that ratio is called sleep efficiency. Also, for the sake of keeping things straight, there are three levels at which these measures can vary. There's the between population, US versus Tsimane, for example. Then there's between people. This is how much I sleep on average versus how much you sleep on average. And then there's the within person level. How much do I sleep today versus tomorrow? How much do you sleep today versus tomorrow? And in terms of what I'm interested in, this is more the level where all the action is happening. And the way that I do that, way I examine that is by controlling for between people variation as a random effect in linear models, for those of you who are statistically inclined. So how do I measure sleep? There are two watches, two devices, the ActiWatch and the Actigraph. You wear them just like a wristwatch, kind of like an Apple Watch, I believe has the same internal technology. My watch has the same technology. Fitbit is the same technology. It's accelerometry that uses your motion to calculate sleep from wake. With these watches, I have an average of 5 nights per person with these number of people. This is what the data looks like. The height of these black bars represents the amount of motion for a 1 minute. What's that?
Who are the subjects?
In this particular graph, this was me. These subjects are Tsimane. I think that's what you're, yes. Right. So this is what the data looks like. This is the height, is the amount of movement. As you can see here, the pattern, the profile of movement activity is very different in these hours than in these hours. You don't see just straight zeros, even if you're a heavy sleeper, which I typically, compared to average I am. There's still plenty of movement happening, but the profile is very different. And you can reliably distinguish sleep from wake with this technology compared to brain scans, which is considered the gold standard. There's an agreement rate of about 92%, an average deviation of about 20 minutes maximum per night. In terms of merging these two data sets together from these two watches, I wrote a program in R to kind of counteract the differences that may come from different softwares and different scoring algorithms. There's a formula that takes your amount of movement on this minute and the next minute to calculate a likelihood of being awake or asleep for that minute. But it has to be applied to a specific period of time. And for those of you who may have experimented with Fitbit or other sleep trackers, this is not very good. This is why these programs always ask you to tell them when you went to sleep and when you woke up. Typically in the field, what you would do is you'd have these automatic scorings, and then you would just kind of review and see if anything funky is happening and fix it. That's not a very consistent way to do that. So to counteract that, what I did is I wrote this program. It creates these nice big graphs, one night at a time. And I have a standardized set of criteria to evaluate and see, when did this person go to sleep? Was it at 5:30? Was it at 8? Was it at 9:30? What was it? And basically, because I know that people are typically spending a lot of time in quiescent activity like chatting before bed, which is not a lot of movement, and then they have these large spikes of movement of similar magnitude here, I would evaluate that as going to bed around 9:30. Time of wake is a little bit easier because there tends to be this monotonic quadratic increase in the activity profile. So by applying this to my entire data set, I was able to reliably merge the two of them together. The two measures from the two watches agreed at a rate of over 90% with an average deviation of 4 minutes. So they're pretty much the same. Maybe not interesting, but I hopefully defend myself against future questions that may come up. To supplement that, I did a bunch of interviews. Typically, they were done in-home. I did not want to be altering people's normal behavioral patterns, so I did not always find them because those who I would visit early in the day were still home, and those who I went to after in my sequence of interviews may not have always been there. So for that reason, I didn't always get 3 interviews per person. I got a little bit less. Obviously, this photo is from not in-home, but I wouldn't have had a photo if I was in home because no one else I knew would have been there. The content of these interviews was to ask about how are you doing? Were you tired before bed? How tired were you? Were you sleepy? How about when you woke up? Did you sleep well? What did you do before bed? Did you wake up during the night? What woke you up? Do you share your bed with anyone? Do you have walls on your house? All sorts of questions, these kind of qualitative, or maybe not qualitative, but these kinds of descriptive measures to supplement the objective data coming from the sleep monitors. Yeah?
Do you control for sleep disorders such as sleep apnea?
Sleep apnea is not present in these populations. By these populations, I mean these three. This is primarily for Chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 focus only on this one. These three populations are the Tsimane, the San, and the Hadza. The Hadza in Tanzania, San in Namibia, Tsimane in Bolivia. And what these three populations have in common is a subsistence lifestyle. These two are considered hunter-gatherers, and these are considered hunter-horticulturalists. The difference being that they have small garden plots cultivated by hand to get plant food to supplement wild game as the meat that comes in. This is distinguished from farming because with farming you have division of labor in a society on a societal level where you have this is the farmer, this is the blacksmith, this is the something else. That does not happen with Tsimane. Everyone is a farmer. Other than that, these three populations have very little in common. They're at different latitudes, different continents, different colonial histories, different biomes. This is a tropical rainforest, whereas this is the Kalahari Desert. This is also a very dry area as well. And what we found is that sleep is very similar in all three populations. They're spending 7 to 8.5 hours in bed, 5.7 to 7.1 hours of sleep per night, going to bed 3 hours after sunset, waking up at the coldest point. Typically this was at dawn, but there was one exception, which is the San in the winter, waking up about an hour after sunrise rather than an hour or half hour before sunrise. Having been there this past winter, I can tell you the reason's very simple, at least on a qualitative level. If you woke up in the morning and it was 45 degrees in your bedroom, would you want to jump out of bed and start your day, or would you want to turn over and stay in bed a little longer until it got a little warmer? That's currently my explanation for this finding. There's very little insomnia reported in these populations, probably on the order of 2 to 5% using very generous criteria for what counts as insomnia, which is a far cry from the 20 to 30% often reported in the US. There's very little napping. This will be something that has to be looked at a little more carefully because there may be observation bias. I got a slight impression that napping was considered lazy among Tsimane because you're sleeping when you should be working. But even still, I would say that there's very little napping based off of being there and actually seeing when people are asleep and when they're awake. They don't sleep biphasically, at least not on the typical night. It may happen sometimes, but it's not the common pattern. And then there's a strong seasonal variation. Winter sleep, when you have longer periods of dark, the sleep is 1 hour longer than in the summer when it's longer periods of light. At least this is in the San and the Tsimane at the lower latitudes and less equatorial regions. Whether this is extended sleep in the winter or shortened sleep in the summer remains to be seen, as are the consequences of this difference in sleep duration. But these are focuses for further studies and not for today. So what does this all mean? People are definitely staying awake well after sunset, even without electricity. In fact, the sleep duration there is not very different from here. It's actually at the lower end of the distribution for American sleep. The averages may be similar everywhere, but the variation at both between individual and within individual levels may be different there from here. Perhaps because we have different dynamics of trade-offs, because if you have no electricity and there's really not that much to do at night, you don't tend to stay up late that often. Whereas here, there may be other kinds of things that keep you up. Maybe it's Sunday night, your favorite show is on, maybe you're invited to go somewhere, maybe you have a lot of work to do and you have a deadline. These kinds of things aren't as common in those three populations. So what are people doing at night? So for this, chapters 2 and 3, I focus on Tsimane specifically and exclusively, which merits a little bit more introduction to, or a little more detail in describing their lifestyle. Hunter horticulturalism means that hunting, I think, is a little bit clear. Horticulture, extremely labor intensive. You know, it hurts. You're working very hard every day. The rainforest is not the best place to grow crops. You have hand tools like a shovel or a machete to cut down rainforest and clear these fields using slash and burn, and that's how you get your food. The reason that I'm harping on food specifically is because unlike here, where you can go to the store or you can do various different kinds of things in periods of shortage to find food, they don't have that kind of recourse. If they want more food, they have to go out and do more work to get it, which may trade off against sleep. And by may, I mean I'm going to specifically tell you about that. So here's a wall of numbers giving you a description of the sleep patterns for Tsimane. Specifically, here are the averages. These are the values that probably of most interest to you. These columns here are the average of the averages. So you take an individual average, and you do that for everyone, and then you average it. That's this column. And then this column is your intra-individual variation. How much does each person vary from night to night on average? And I want to point out that your variation from night to night within individual is much larger than your variation between individuals. So much has been said of this kind of personal difference. I need a lot of sleep. You don't need as much as I do. That's this column. This column eclipses that by quite a bit. And in these mixed model regressions, about 30% of the variation in total sleep duration is attributable to the level of between individual, leaving about 70% to be attributable to the level of within individual. This is what the typical Tsimane night looks like. For those of you who can't read it, I'll explain this graph a little bit. At the end of the workday, around 5 or 6 o'clock, the first thing people tend to do in this population is take a bath. That's this black bar. This is the distribution of the times at which people would take a bath. These are low S smooths, by the way. Then, after bathing, they eat dinner. That's the red bar. And then the blue bar is when they went to bed. And you see there's definitely a fairly sizable segment of time separating these two activities. For the 3 most commonly reported activities done before bed, which is just going straight to sleep, which maybe you don't consider an activity before bed, but this is the response, the way the question was asked, compared to relaxing before bed or listening to radio before bed, you see that those who went to bed right after dinner, not going to bed really any later than anyone else, but they are eating dinner later. So this kind of sleep time is not necessarily as variant as your dinner time. So let's go into a little more detail here. 3 most commonly reported activities are here. Relax is kind of, I was just sitting and chatting. What that entails is chatting with only your immediate family and only in your own home. How you want to phrase that, chillin', chillaxin', whatever, resting. That's the most common activity that people do before bed. Listening to the radio is very common for Tsimane as well, because there is a broadcast in their own local language, which gives them news, current events, political issues, whatever. And typically everyone listens to that before they go to bed if they want to get information on anything that's happening. They have batteries and whatnot for these kinds of AM radios. Whether or not the time of the radio show is keeping people up or it was set because of when people are normally going to bed on their own is another question to look into down the road. Other activities less commonly reported but still significant in order are these 4. For men, housework was number 7. For women, it was number 4, and the reverse for food productive activities. Food productive activities includes hunting, fishing, and gathering of plant foods from their garden. You have a question? Television is extremely rare, but when I did come across the few people who had it, I oversampled them for the sake of seeing what the effect is in maximizing statistical power. There were only 2 villages that actually had electricity that I went to out of 9 villages. There are 90 villages total. Probably, I would say, somewhere in the range of 5 to 8 have power right now as of the last 2 years. There are public works in process to extend it to them, but it's very, very rare. Certainly not the common pattern. But when it is available, people avail themselves of it, and they like to watch TV, or they like to go to their neighbor's house and watch TV. In terms of predicting the incidence rate of getting food at night, men on average 10% of nights recorded, women 1%. I have a regression model here. This is a logistic mixed model. The intercept is negative because of this variable, hunger level. Hunger is measured on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 meaning really full, 2 is a little full, 3 is a little hungry, 4 is really hungry. It's not until you get, I have this set to number 2, it's not until you get to a little hungry where you have a positive intercept, which makes sense. If you're not hungry, why should you bother to do it? Well, the answer is they don't. But you're seeing here that the largest effect is from reporting not having any dinner. The reason people don't have dinner, or what they say, is that they don't have any food, which they usually mean they don't have any meat, but it could extend to other types of food from plants as well. Number of children positively associated, though not quite significant. That may be because of other controls. That may be because the sample size is too small. Maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. I leave that for you to decide. But you do see that men are definitely doing this much more. How does that affect sleep? What I have here is the top 7 activities, which I've already introduced you to, as predictors of variation in sleep, both bedtime on this side and total sleep on this side, with the baseline being just going to sleep. So compared to just going to sleep after dinner, what's the effect of these different activities on your sleep patterns? I've highlighted the significant results. I present them all to you just for the sake of those who are interested, but I do want to draw your attention specifically to these 2. Yeah?
Is this including daytime naps also, or just the nighttime sleep activities?
This is just nighttime activities. What do you do after dinner? What do you do after the workday is over? You see that TV, huge effect. Maybe not surprising given the effects of blue light and whatever the kind of conventional knowledge we have about sleep. Not necessarily my focus, but I will just add in a tidbit, because I have a little bit of time. When I did this originally, it had to be half an hour. The effect of TV on sleep is much stronger for those who don't actually have electricity in their homes than for those who do. In other words, for those who had to take a walk to go visit their neighbor to watch TV, the effect was much stronger than those who own the TV. So it's not just the blue light, the artificial light that's affecting sleep. There's a couple of behavioral decisions being made that are affecting sleep, I would argue. The largest impact, though, is definitely from getting food. Even after controlling for sex differences and all these other things, you see this enormous effect going to bed over 3 hours later and losing over 2 hours of your sleep for that night. For those of you who are watching carefully, sunset time, you might expect to have a stronger effect on sleep initiation than on total sleep. You don't find that. I've done a few analyses, but not necessarily enough that I would want to publish so far, but what they would suggest is that the reason this is not significant is because these are all included, which I would interpret to mean that when there's more sunlight at night, when the sun sets at a later time, you're more likely to do these things, and that's what's driving the difference in bedtime, not the actual light itself. That's not necessarily the focus for right now. So what I do want you to take away from this set of results is that variation in nighttime behavior is considerable. over the 3 nights of observation, about a third of people did the same thing every night, and about half of the people, a third of the people did something different every night of those all 3 nights. And then half of the people did the same thing twice, but not 3 times. So there's not a uniform behavioral profile from night to night. That's not typically what people are doing. Even with these relatively rudimentary catch-all kind of categories for behavior, you still find that. So also kind of that same dynamic, sleep patterns vary tremendously from night to night for the same person. Is that similar to our dynamic of weekday sleep versus weeknight sleep? Maybe, maybe not. We don't necessarily know so far. What we do know is that our dynamic is crystallized into a pattern of 5 nights of short sleep and 2 nights of longer sleep, as opposed to 1 up, 1 down, 1 up, 1 down, which may be more the pattern with Tsimane because they don't have these social economic constraints on their sleep patterns. Times of need, times of hunger, times of not having food, much more likely to go out and get it at night. One of the questions I asked in my interview, just to get more ethnographic detail, was, why did you do this at night? Why didn't you just do it in the daytime? And they would say, I couldn't do it in the daytime, of course. I had no time. I was working in my field all day. So I had to wait until after dinner or after nighttime, come home from work, rest a little bit, and then go out hunting and stay up all night. And they say, oh, okay, well, you must be tired. In a few cases, people stayed up all night. You must be so tired. You're just going to sleep all day now, right? And they would say, I can't sleep all day. I got to go back to my field and work. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say there's these constraints on people and their activities. They don't have this kind of food security and budget, whatnot, to be able to afford that rest. They have to have their behavior determined more by their immediate needs. Big drop in sleep, less useful activities. I say less useful, but maybe those utility is less explored would be a better way to put it. Listening to the radio, visiting your neighbor and chatting with your immediate family. Maybe these things all do have value, but relative to getting food when you're hungry, it's not that high, and it's not associated with that big of a drop in your sleep. What about variation in the middle of the night? Is it the same for everyone? Once you go to bed, is the story over? Answer, in short, is no. For this study, I'm using degree of exposure as a proxy for danger. Some people sleep in a space like this, no walls. They do have mosquito nets, but there are no walls, and these are houses that do have walls. These walls are not very good thermal insulators. They're not very good for keeping out mosquitoes. What they are good for is making sure that wild animals don't crawl into your house or other people that you don't want to be coming inside. There may be other benefits to it, but they're not obvious to me if they are. But I can tell you that definitely is not making a difference in temperature or in terms of bugs. And I will have the quantitative data to back that up very soon. So, in terms of comparing people's sleep in these 2 situations, you see that the number of reported interruptions per night, not statistically different, but the types of things that wake people up at night is statistically different. By extrinsic, I've coded things that are external to the body that you might not be as able to predict. Things like another person waking you up, things like the cold, things like noise that's being made. You don't have control over that. Things that you might have some kind of subconscious control over is waking up to pee, which is, urinate, this is professional context. Waking up to urinate is something that maybe you can predict and you adjust your time in bed accordingly without it being conscious. I don't think that's the case, but it's possible. That's why I've coded it this way. What are the actual things people report doing? These are the profiles. What I find to be very interesting kind of about this dynamic is that children is the #1 effect. This rate goes up tremendously. And this is a statistically significant difference. There's also a statistically significant interaction whereby sharing your bed with your children makes them much more likely to wake you up for this reason when you don't have walls than when you do. Why should walls have that kind of effect? Maybe it has something to do with vigilance. This is the argument I'm trying to make anyway. Obviously, this is very preliminary, but the association hopefully is enough to be provocative. You also find a statistically significant difference in the rate of animals waking you up. One of the reasons I would argue, or I'm interpreting, that you don't see a difference in absolute number of wakes per night between these two groups, but only in the types, is because if your children wake up and you have to change the diaper and you have to pee, may as well do it then rather than go to bed and wake up again later. That kind of a thing. What about objective sleep? Well, here's another wall of numbers, gives you the profile of the difference in sleep between those with walls and without walls. The only significant difference in the average is in sleep efficiency. This is the percentage of time you spent asleep for a given time in bed, higher for those with walls. This is consistent with the hypothesis that vigilance is an important opportunity cost of sleep, and you don't have to be as on alert when you have walls to protect you compared to when you don't. You also see some significant differences in the variances, though. Time in bed, bedtime, this is more approaching significance for bedtime. Wake time is significant, and number of intrinsic wakes, some things like dreams, waking up to urinate, etc. More variant when you do have walls. This is a little bit different from what I was predicting. I would have thought that if you don't have walls, you're in this unpredictable kind of context, that you should see more variation there. But we see the opposite. You're seeing much more variation when you do have walls. Why might that be? Well, I'll come to that. In terms of sleep efficiency, since this is where the biggest difference was, here's a graph showing your time in bed versus your total sleep time with the identity line here. You really can't see anything with the scatter plot, so let's take that away. Here are your low S smooths. Black line is for those with walls, red line is for those without walls. This is a significant interaction, even if it looks small on this scale. What it means is, to put it in context, at one standard deviation below the mean, for the same amount of time in bed, having walls means you're getting about 6 minutes more of sleep. At the average value, you're getting 12 minutes more of sleep. And one standard deviation above it, you're getting 19 minutes more of sleep. What's the value of those extra minutes? In the long run, that's something that can be explored, but this is definitely the pattern that we're finding now. So I also tried to, well, you'll come to see why I did this, but I looked at the difference in sleep within group. So I've split the sample here into those with walls against those without walls. And then I took, after it was split in two, I split it into tertiles. The shortest sleepers, the middle sleepers, and the longest sleepers, to compare them between these two groups. And what I found is that for the longest sleepers in both groups, their average sleep is about the same. There's not much difference. But the shortest sleepers in the two groups, there is a significant difference, where those without walls are still sleeping significantly longer than those with walls. So I'm interpreting this to be a kind of a floor effect. You're seeing that people without walls are going to bed earlier and at more consistent times, and they have a higher floor for sleep. So, putting this together, to recap, longer in bed, less sleep. You can read this as I go along. What I want to be talking about is that this might be an actual adaptation. This may be a behavioral response. If you don't have walls, if you have this unpredictable and unreliable kind of sleep context, and you want to get the same amount of sleep, but you don't know if something's going to wake you up during the night, maybe you then choose to go to bed earlier at a more consistent time, spend longer in bed, and therefore, even if something wakes you up, you get the same amount of sleep that you would need to. And that's why you don't see a significant difference in average sleep in these two groups. Maybe this allows you to sleep longer sometimes. When you prepare for something to wake you up and it doesn't come, you end up sleeping longer. That may be why you get this non-significant positive effect of not having walls. This is my interpretation for now. Obviously, it's fairly preliminary and will require some follow-up, but that would be the third chapter. So to put this all together, what am I telling you about the night? I'm telling you that vigilance is an important opportunity cost of sleep. But it's also a case where you can be very productive. There's an episode of Bob's Burgers where he takes a night job driving a taxi because he needs extra money for a birthday party. You're finding that sleep time and wake time vary within person quite a bit. So I'm trying to, I keep saying it like this because I'm trying to paint this picture of a dynamic trade-off between two different behaviors. Maybe we don't want to talk about sleep as a behavior because we treat it as a physiological process. Fine. Let's talk about time in bed as a behavior then. Laying down, trying to sleep. If you have the choice between laying down and trying to sleep and doing something else, what you decide will be very different from day to day depending on your other alternative activities and what you are worried about that day. So this is typically referred to as a reaction norm. This is not really the appropriate graph because we're not talking about difference in genotypes, but I do like the visual imagery that this kind of conveys. On one night, when I don't have anything really important going on, I may sleep a lot. But then later, I may sleep less because maybe I work weekends only. Whereas my roommate, hypothetically, maybe does not work weekends. Maybe they work weekdays, and they sleep less on these days and more on those days. This is very kind of hard to pin down phenotype, like a behavior. This is what I'm trying to really emphasize as I'm being repetitive on purpose. Higher opportunity costs, you sleep less, you got better things to do. Lower opportunity costs later. This could even be part of the trade-off is I'm especially tired because I stayed up late last night working on something else. Sleep more when I don't have anything important going on. Long-term average sleep, unchanged. We're finding very, very few significant differences in total sleep duration within Tsimane or across the three populations, Tsimane, San, and Hadza. Very few differences. So this is my proposed explanation. So what does that mean for us? Is it good? Is it healthy to inhibit sleep? It's certainly common. If we see it in Tsimane, and we experience it in our own lives, and we see it in the preliminary analyses for the San, it suggests that this is a very common thing, maybe even a universal. I would argue that it's a universal. Your health may suffer because of inhibiting sleep in these kinds of situations, but the effects have to be measured correctly. You can't just say, I stayed up this late, now look how terrible I feel the next day. That's not necessarily going to tell you something about your long-term health. If you sleep terribly one night, or you sleep very little one night, and then the next night you make it up, there may be a consequence in your long-term health from doing that rather than sleeping the same amount both nights for the same total sleep duration over 2 nights. But it's not the same as your deprivation effects. And as this has been studied so far has been termed social jet lag, where they control for sleep duration over this extended period of time. What's the effect of greater variation night to night versus less? And they do find negative effects, much smaller though than outright sleep deprivation. The thing about social jet lag though is that it's more considered because of the desynchrony with the natural light rhythms, because you're basically ignoring them when you stay up late on weeknights and then sleep longer on weekends, sleeping in very late. So whether that same kind of effect holds for these populations where it is not the same kind of desynchronization with light that's consequent of night-to-night variation is something that will have to be looked at more. So again, my argument, sleep inhibition is adaptive, but only in specific situations. You have to have an actual opportunity cost. We may be seeing pathological manifestations of sleep inhibition when you wake up for reasons that are not helpful. If you have some kind of latent anxiety about things, and that's waking you up at night, that may not be helping you. Jerry Siegel in the psychiatry department, who's now my postdoc advisor at the Semel Institute, he is very much against this hysteria about short sleep, where he feels that some research is kind of fostering this anxiety about not sleeping enough to the point where it becomes pathological, perhaps as a way to sell sleeping pills. That's a very cynical opinion. He's very senior, and he has tenure, and he can say those things. I don't know anything about it. Everybody, whatever you want to say is fine. Maybe that's the case. That's all I know. I don't have any data, so I have no opinions. The alternative, though, is obviously not very good, right? You don't just want to sleep more indiscriminately. You have to be very targeted about it. And hopefully, throughout the course of this talk, I've made somewhat of a foundational argument that opportunity costs are driving this difference, this kind of dynamic pattern. What does it mean for our sleep? The reaction norm may be a human universal, but that doesn't mean that sleep will look the same everywhere. For example, Tsimane don't worry about clowns eating them. I guarantee you that is not a common Tsimane fear, but maybe it is here. We also have electricity, internet, things that we can do at night and be productive. I don't know how many of you like to go camping here. When I gave this talk in Albuquerque, it was pretty much everyone. Maybe in LA it's not quite the same, I don't know. But there's not a lot to do, especially if you've already run out of booze. When you've got electricity, internet, Netflix, TV, whatever, there's a lot of things you can do at night. Maybe this is crystallized in us having higher opportunity costs every night, and that there is some kind of difference. We haven't seen it so far, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. So this may be an extreme manifestation, maybe even to the extent of pathological levels. That's fine. So what does this tell us about human evolution? This is, we've seen how evolution can tell us about sleep. What can sleep tell us about human evolution? Not much yet, but I would argue that there is some potential for that, and I'll go through some directions that I see for this here. Certainly, this is a very different context for sleep than this is. In terms of nighttime danger, there may be a difference. There's been much made of the fact that we sleep on the ground instead of in trees, and that maybe sleeping in trees is a way to protect yourself. And the reason that Australopithecines have maintained arboreal adaptations and early Homo has not is because early Homo slept on the ground and not in trees, and that the reason it persisted as long as it did to have these arboreal adaptations, even with fully bipedal locomotion, is for sleeping sites. That's the argument that's been made. So maybe the predation is an issue. I don't necessarily have a problem with this idea, but we have to also consider the fact that predation on chimpanzees to begin with is not very high, nor is it high on humans. And so, if there are other factors other than just sleeping in trees or on the ground, it's a very simple story, but I don't think that the effects are necessarily as large as they're purported to be. Fire has been the idea of why people are able to sleep on the ground. You can protect yourself because you have these fires that deter predators. This may be a real thing. Again, the magnitude is unclear, but I would mention that when I was working in Namibia with the San, I asked them specifically about this. Everyone has campfires, and they keep it burning throughout the night, and I say, why? And they said, because if you don't have the fire going, you don't have the smoke circulating through the area for the animals to smell. If they don't smell it, then they're more likely to come over here. If they do smell it, they will stay away. So maybe some kind of signaling to these other species, there are humans here, stay away. I don't think it's a big roaring fire that's scaring them away. That's not what it seems like. But maybe it was different in other times. What I do think is under-considered is the risk of falling. It's a very common source of injury for arboreal primates to fall out of trees and break limbs. This is not a small concern. It's also a high cause of mortality. If you're and it's even argued as part of the reason why we have binocular vision, right? For primates in general, is one of these theories is you need the depth perception to move around in trees safely. You need to have good vision. If it's dark and it's nighttime, and you don't have that, it may be very dangerous to move around at night. If you're sleeping on the ground, your risk of falling down is much, much lower, and if you do fall, your injury risk is much, much lower. So it may be creating a situation in which staying up late and being active is actually safer for us than it would be for non-human primates. So just something to throw into the mix. Also, part of the story, humans eating after sunset. This is, again, part of the thing that's pushing back human sleep from starting around sunset by several hours, is they're, on average, eating dinner after sunset. Well, that is not something you're going to see a chimpanzee do, because we have semi-permanent sleeping sites where we have people go out, they get some food, they forage, and they bring it home. They don't eat it on the spot and then just sleep wherever they're done eating. They bring it home. They have lots of children at home that they're provisioning. And so to be able to do this, there's a lot going on. These are a lot of unique human traits that make this seemingly simple behavior of eating dinner after sunset, really sensitive. We don't see it in chimpanzees, and we're not going to see it in chimpanzees because they don't have these things to motivate it. There may be rare cases in captivity where you can manufacture an environment where it'll happen, but they're certainly not idealized for it the way that we are. So take-home messages, opportunity costs, capacity to do stuff after dark. We do have to worry about dangers at night, maybe not in the same way as non-human primates, but it is a real thing. Maybe in our populations, compared to Tsimane, they're not worried about animals, or we're not worried about animals. We're worried about burglars or anything else. Tsimane do report losing sleep because they're staying up worrying. Many people have told me, I asked them, did you have any trouble falling asleep? They would say yes. And I said, why? And they would say, I was really worried because my two daughters are fighting and they're not speaking with one another, or this terrible thing happened to my relative and I'm really worried about her. They worry at night. And maybe that is the same kind of thing that's happening here. Maybe our lifestyle has more chronic stress than their lifestyle, which is leading to the higher rates of insomnia and sleep pathology that we're seeing here than there. What is optimal sleep? Well, theoretically speaking, I think I would summarize that by saying that sleep fits into your life rather than interrupting your life. On a practical level, I would stick with the same conventional recommendation, which is if you are sleeping and you think it's fine, then it's fine. If you're not happy with the way you're sleeping, then maybe you should try to think about changing some things. Future directions for research that I'll be working on here in the next couple of years. What are the effects of sleep duration? We know that you feel lousy when you don't sleep enough. What does that actually mean in an evolutionary context, or at least an ecological context? I have some preliminary data where I asked people, what did you think you were going to do today when you first woke up? What did you actually do today? These would actually be retroactive, so it was more like, what did you do yesterday? And there were a lot of times when people had a plan and they didn't do it. And I said, well, why didn't you do it? And they would say, because I was too tired. I was too tired to take my machete, go to my field, and cut down shrubs for 8 hours. I wasn't too tired to just rest half the morning and then do a little bit of light work in the afternoon, or to go harvesting, or to go fishing, that kind of a thing. What does this trade-off dynamic look like in other populations? Sure, that's great for Tsimane. What does it look elsewhere? I've started to explore this with the san a little bit. I don't think it's going to be nearly as clean a relationship there as it is with Tsimane because of food provisioning and a very different dynamic of food security, which is highly seasonal, which is going to require a lot of nuance to see these trade-offs. But I would feel confident in saying that if this model works for Tsimane and it works for San, that there will be a way to defensibly apply it to life here, to sleep here. Other opportunity costs, things like childcare, things like life history. If you're 60 years old, how much do you care about this bodily maintenance per night versus when you're 30? What about when you're 75? What about when you're 40? All these different things are likely influencing these trade-offs. And what are the benefits to the human species from being able to do these things? There's a lot of possible ways to go with that. Maybe the capacity for being active at night means that you don't have to get it all done in the daytime, whatever it is that you need to do. And so if you're in a harsher environment where you're not able to do that so easily, you could still be okay. So, sky's the limit. A lot of future directions possible. And I vow that I will not rest until the opportunity costs are sufficiently low for me to do so. But before I get to all that, I would like to thank everyone who contributed to my dissertation research, give a plug to these two wonderful projects I work for, particularly Tsimane Health and Life History Project, as well as now the Siegel Sleep Lab, my work in Namibia. My field guides were quite excellent. Funding sources, of course, the community at UNM, and now my new community here at UCLA. Thank you. I think before we get into it, I would just say that we should maybe start with clarifying questions. I'm okay with general questions, but I think we should stick with clarifying questions first, just to keep the conversation kind of in a logical progression. Okay. Who didn't raise their hand in a question yet? Yeah.
You're going to general now?
Oh, start with clarifying. Yeah.
Bed partners, what are the frequency of bed partners in these populations, and did you look at any associations between whether bed partners influence the pattern?
Yes. Good question. The average, or maybe median, typical pattern is you share your bed with your spouse, a nursing infant, and your next youngest child. That's the most common pattern. In some cases, it can be up to 5 kids in the bed. In some cases that are much rarer, no kids in the bed. Even older people tend to bed share with their grandchildren. The effect that it has on sleep is very similar to that with walls. There's been a lot made of co-sleeping, as they call it, that it entrains your sleep patterns and improves your sleep, and maybe that's the case, but the data that I've seen suggests that when you sleep by yourself, your bedtime is later and more consistent. And when you have more bed partners, you're going to bed earlier and at more variable times, which I would interpret as being the risk of waking up at night from interruption, similar to the lack of walls. Yeah.
Well, then this is a follow-up on his. When do conjugal pairings occur? I didn't see references to that, and I certainly can think of one specific instance where sleep inhibition is adaptive.
Yes.
Right, correct.
Yes. I was strongly encouraged not to include that in my interview when I first formed it, and I followed that advice, and it was probably good advice. But I couldn't help from asking ethnographically to at least get somewhat of an answer to that. And that answer is they wait for the children to fall asleep. And so there's your sleep inhibition staying up late.
But there's no quantification of that in this data, is that right?
There is not. Any more clarifying questions? Yes.
I gather you didn't collect any data from children? You
Uh,
don't have any developmental information?
I don't have developmental, no.
Change over time?
Right. The youngest couple that I sampled was a married couple of 13 and 15, but I don't really have a lot of density in that age distribution of teenage to early 20s to say much about that. And in fact, I had to eliminate them from most analyses to focus on adult sleep for this reason. Should we move to, yeah.
Are we in the general question?
Yeah, I was about to say, let's move to that.
So first, thanks, very stimulating material, and I'm asking you to speculate here,
Okay.
based on your insights with regard to the difference that walls make and your ideas about vigilance, which are quite plausible. I think it was Jerry Siegel who last year told us that that when people sleep in a new location and they're not in familiar settings, there are both measurable differences in brain activity during the night and observable differences in sleep. And at first pass, that seems perfectly plausible, right? Well, you're in a new location, there's probably heightened vigilance, you become familiar with your surroundings. But then when you sort of push past that and look at it ethnographically, it's quite puzzling because it makes sense that if you're a sedentary population and you are now in a new location, things are really different. But if you're, you know, say a San or a Hadza, you move, you know, on the order of every few weeks to every few months. And even at that, it's not clear that having slept in a location for multiple nights changes the optimal level of vigilance. Because, for example, if you're concerned about large predators, they have big ranges, right? They move around a lot. So the fact that you have slept in a location for 4 nights and haven't encountered a lion doesn't tell you anything about the probability that in a given night you will encounter a lion. And if your concern is not with predators but with conspecifics, the same is going to be true, right? People move around a lot. So the question then is, and I'm asking you to speculate, as I said, do you think that that pattern of enhanced vigilance with perhaps compensatory increase in duration is going to be characteristic of populations like those that you studied, particularly those that are not sedentary?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is, what's the functional explanation?
Well, Tsimane are not migratory, so they're not necessarily very insightful. So all I know is from my very limited ethnographic work that I've done so far with San, it's not just that they have to see the animal to know that it's there. They actually have a very good handle on where all the elephants, lions, hyenas, etc. are relative to the village based off the tracks. And when there are animals that are closer, they know about it, which when they're moving around, maybe they don't have so much knowledge about that. So in cases where you're migrating to a new area and you don't have such extensive knowledge about the surroundings from the tracks because you spent the whole day moving there rather than searching the surrounding areas, maybe there is some benefit to this heightened kind of vigilance levels. That would be my speculation.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, sort of building off the seasonal effects that you saw, I'm just wondering about some other seasonally related factors that might matter in terms of vigilance. So, there are seasonal risks to malaria, and so I work at a similar latitude with the Himba rate, and so I know there are seasonal risks to malaria. But there are also seasonal risks to things like snakes. So when it's cold in the wintertime, the risk of the snake coming out at night and crawling into your head is quite low, much higher during the summertime. So I'm just wondering whether you can sort of, if this is really all about temperature, these seasonal effects, or how you would kind of parse out the different, these different kinds of risks that are overlaid on top of temperature.
Well, Jerry Siegel would probably say that temperature is the major thing. That's what he's really interested in studying, which I guess by extension means I am now interested in studying. And I think that is probably going to be part of it. But everything you're saying makes complete sense to me, and I think qualitatively is very obvious very quickly, these kinds of things. When I was there in March of this year, it was pretty warm at night. We actually did see a snake come into camp. Snakes seem to be common fear everywhere. It's the #1 reported nighttime fear for Tsimane, in fact. Number 2 is the cold. Interesting enough.
Have the same kind of seasonal variation of those risks. That I'm not familiar enough with the ecology to know whether malaria
Yeah.
and snake risk is seasonal or not.
They don't worry about malaria. maybe it's more dengue. It does seem like it. There are more bugs in the rainy season. I think it's much less pronounced in that environment, though, than it is in Namibia, just because it's tropical and, you know, you have the rainy season and the very rainy season, not the rainy season and the dry season kind of thing. So,
Dengue and mosquitoes might be deadly, right? Is that, you're wrong about that, so it wouldn't be as much of a, shouldn't affect your sleep patterns.
I'm more familiar with the downstream with dengue than I am with the upstream, my personal experience, but that may be the case. I don't know.
I don't know about middle of the night.
Yeah.
You reported sex differences with men sleeping less than women. Was that present in all three of the populations you studied, that sex difference? And do you know if that's true in the literature beyond, beyond those three populations that you studied?
In the U.S., the pattern is there. Men sleep less than women consistently. In the small sampling of my friends, when I wanted to make sure all the monitors worked before I took them to the field, that pattern held up. Tsimane, it's certainly a very strong effect. In that particular study, we did not find an effect, but I'm a little, I think that some of the analyses that we did, some of the statistical methods, personally I would have done a little bit differently if I was the only author involved. And so there may be a more nuanced way to look at it, and I do think that there will be found in all three populations. With the San, women and children go to bed much earlier than the men. And this is kind of the same with Tsimane. The reason they're sleeping less is they're going to bed later. They wake up at the same time. I did another set of analyses, actually, that kind of speak to this. I asked people in their interviews, did you go to bed at the same time as your spouse? Yes or no? And when they said yes, the whole profile of sleep for men and women, pretty much the same. When they said no, women went to bed at about the same time they normally did, no statistical difference. Men were staying up about 2 hours later. So whatever kind of dynamic is happening there with sex differences, I think is somewhat driven by that. Are there questions related to that specific topic? Yeah?
Yeah. Thinking about this research and the sex difference in terms of opportunity costs, do you think there might be a life history difference where men are foregoing more sleep to pursuing maybe a past life history by doing more things like that?
Yeah, I think so. In the medical field, the value of sociality is not really appreciated, but I think in this room, it's certainly recognized as an important thing to invest in. In a lot of these kinds of populations, the expanded network seems to have larger benefits for men than for women, at least in some of these study populations, which may be partly what's driving it. It may be also the fact that women's work may be less sensitive in terms of productivity to fatigue than men's work, maybe. Or maybe it's the opposite, where men maybe are only working, 2 or 3 days, they only go hunting 2 or 3 days in a month, whereas women are working hard every day, and so it could be the opposite as well. There's a lot of different possible ways this could manifest, but those are just some of the ones I've hypothesized. Yeah?
Just going back to the hunting, because you mentioned that as an important sex difference, and that men were choosing to hunt at night. You kind of framed it in terms of, they're busy in the gardens during the day, so they only have that time. But are there preferred prey items that are nocturnal or that are easier to capture at night, and
Yes.
kind of what's going on there?
There are. And it's not the same on every night either, especially for things like fishing. I would have predicted that they prefer it to be really bright, full moon, so they can see better. They told me the opposite, so it just goes to show the value of doing a lot of ethnography. They say that when there's a new moon and it's really dark or there's cloud cover, the fish don't see them coming, so they can get very close to make the kill more easily. It also helps that it's low tide for the sake of fishing. In terms of hunting, because Tsimane sometimes have access to firearms, they described it as being extremely easy, where they just sit under a fruiting tree and they wait, and an animal will or will not show up to eat the fruit, They quickly shine a light, they make sure it's not a person, and they shoot. And it's that easy. Maybe if they didn't have firearms, it wouldn't be quite that easy, but something along those lines may be the traditional kind of pattern. Yeah?
I have two comments and ask questions. The first was to address your variants that you're seeing. You showed them in a few of the comparisons, but for instance, the one you showed in sleeping quarters that had walls versus those that didn't have walls. Now, I know you did objective and subjective, but one of the disadvantages of the accelerometry is that you don't get sleep-wake architecture. So you can't measure sleep depth. So I was just wanted to suggest that some of that variance may come from differences in sleep-wake architecture. If it's more noisy, it takes a little bit longer to get slower sleep, and that is likely to increase the variability you're seeing. So I guess the question is, did you get any, and I know it's difficult if you're using accelerometry, did you get any indication of variation in slow sleep, sleep depth, sleep-wake architecture at all?
Short answer is no. But I completely agree with your suggestion. And the indirect evidence that I've seen for that in my analyses is that even when you control for reported interruptions, you find this difference in sleep efficiency due to walls is significant, which I interpret as being maybe even after the times when you woke up and you knew you woke up, you're still sleeping lighter when you don't have walls. In terms of doing EEG, brain measurements in the field, it's very difficult, not just because it's hard to get to, hard to maintain these things, but the electrodes are obviously very sensitive, and people sweat because it's so hot and uncomfortable. A lot of the readings are likely to be pretty poor. But it's something that's worth trying and will be trying.
My second question, I brought it up a little earlier, was daytime napping. And I know that is very difficult to assess, like surveys and other subjective measures. If you, that is a little bit more revealed with the risk accelerometry. But my question is, did you get any insight into that? And before you answer that, I just wanted to put it in relation to sex differences. We just talked about that. Now, a lot of the studies that report sex differences don't take midday napping into account. But every study that is focused on midday napping has found sex differences. The majority of those studies have found that men nap more than women. Some of those studies have been done in indigenous populations also. One I was recently reading in the Toronto population in Brazil. But not all of those show a significant difference, but every study I've seen consistently shows that men taking more midday naps than women. So a lot of times when we're looking at these sex differences, we're only looking at nighttime sleep opportunities, not taking the daytime sleep opportunities into account. That being said, did you find any evidence of daytime napping in any of your populations?
Yes. It's at a low rate, and men are doing it more, especially old men. I would propose that the causal pathway for that is that because men are staying up later more than women are, they're then sleeping less, and that therefore are more tired in the daytime. And maybe it's easier for men to sleep in the daytime than it is for women. Another ethnographic observation is from San. They tend to all be located in the same area, so I could actually see what everyone's doing at the same time. This one woman was clearly exhausted because one of her daughters just cries constantly all night long. We were all aware of that in that village. And she was trying to take a nap, and of course the baby was crawling all over her, picking at her face and not letting her do it. For men, it may be a little bit easier to actually do that. So I think there may be a couple pathways that would produce that pattern, but I have seen that, yes.
There's a tenure effect there too for midday napping and
Yeah?
well, we have some data from this.
Yeah.
So I know you said you're just starting to look at effects of childcare and things like that, but do you have data, or are you beginning to collect data on breastfeeding status of women, age of their youngest child, things like that, to try to get a sense of how much breastfeeding is affecting night waking?
Yeah, we have that data. The beauty of working with the Tsimane project is they have pretty much every data marker you could ever want. if you're willing to put in the long hours to clean it up. And in short, with the analyses I've run so far, there is a positive effect of age of youngest child on sleep interruption, especially for women when controlling for a number of children. In other words, younger babies wake you up more, older babies wake you up less. The pattern is there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, you see this as being such a big thing in the American literature, and I'm just wondering if it actually has as detrimental, supposedly detrimental an effect on women's sleep in non-Western populations, or if they're able to sort of make up the deficit in other ways, like this going to bed earlier thing, maybe something that you see less in American women and more in other indigenous populations.
I would guess that that's correct. And I would also add that I think that for them, they may get used to it a little more when your average fertility is 9 than when your average fertility is 2.2, because that's a normal facet of everyday life for your entire adult life. Who had their hand up first? You guys can decide for yourselves.
So just following up on that, you had showed it in terms of number of sleep interruptions, but it wasn't duration of interruption. So I was wondering if there, like that would be kind of following up on what Brooke said. Is it, if it is the child waking them up, is it just a short interruption and then going back to sleep, or does it last for a half an hour? And then also just going back to the walls versus no walls, I was curious what the people themselves said in terms of why they would or would not construct walls around their sleeping area.
Yes, that's a very important point that I always mean to say, but sometimes forget. Living in the tropics, house made entirely out of organics. These houses are temporary structures. Even if you're not nomadic, they build it in the same place. It has to be rebuilt every 3 to 5 years. And it's very labor intensive, especially the walls, which you don't necessarily absolutely need to have a house. You mostly need it for the rain. So a lot of this natural variation is coming from the fact that they're just in different stages of repair. It was about 25% of the population didn't have any walls, 75% did have walls. Now there may also be effects of some people don't want walls. I didn't really find any significant predictors of that, but it's hard to say. It may be because the sampling structure is not ideal. Maybe the time of the year is not ideal for that. There may be an age effect where older people are less likely to worry about having walls, maybe because they don't have children. I don't know. These are all things to look at. What was your first question?
Just asking about interruption duration.
Right. On average, it's about 6 to 8 minutes statistical association of total sleep to sleep interruption. Qualitatively, I asked people, did you stay up for half an hour or longer? And they almost always said no, it was less than half an hour. It's hard to tease out any statistically significant differences in duration of sleep lost due to different types of sleep interruption, because anything smaller than about 12 minutes tends to be non-significant. And if your average duration is 8 to begin with, the difference between 8 and 12 is not going to show up as significant, but it may be real. If I remember correctly, again, this is a relatively preliminary analysis, I wouldn't publish it yet, but it does look like waking up to pee does not have a significant effect on sleep, whereas things like waking up for children does. In terms of the question of breastfeeding, that's still not really quite what we're interested in. It may be the case that the effect of waking up for breastfeeding in the U.S. is different than the effect of waking up for breastfeeding in these kinds of contexts. Certainly, it seems plausible considering that if you just have to roll over and breastfeed the baby, that's a lot less effort than waking up, getting out of bed, getting cold, walking down the hall, grabbing the baby, rocking it, complaining about being awake, getting it back to sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kinds of comparisons that I think would probably speak to that difference a little more directly. Yeah.
I wanted to make one comment, which is that one of the, you found the comparisons of tree foraging, hunting, simple horticultural societies, and the fact that there's a similar total amount of sleep, and that cold and heat or seasonality is a variation, is a, for those of us studying sleep in the US or other countries, is a huge finding, and that the amount of sleep is less than this American Academy of Pediatrics has been saying is the amount of sleep. So one of the media take-home messages of your work, as I've seen it, is that. My question is, first of all, are you able to collect data on, and are there larks and owls in these communities, as has been proposed, are tendencies, evolved tendencies in Western studies, Western populations? And are there beliefs about sleep, like the beliefs in the West, which is, among youth, for example, and adults, it's cool not to sleep much, and people brag about it. And there are beliefs about fears of sleep and how important it is, which leads to a great deal of anxiety in and of itself, not the other anxieties or concerns, but sleep itself is a worry that we have. I wonder if these populations even have such beliefs.
Not that I've seen. I don't see much bragging about loss of sleep either. You kind of see the opposite, like the indirect shadow of that, where I remember one of my really macho translators would be like, I had sex 10 times last night. If that was actually true, I'm sure it would affect his sleep. I don't think it's actually true, but it's not quite the same thing as bragging about not needing a lot of sleep. In terms of larks and owls, kind of is the answer. Not really. I would also suspect that there might be a life history trait, whether you're a lark or an owl, relatively speaking. But it's very different than what we see here. In the few cases where I did sample the younger people, you know, the teenagers, you might expect them to be staying up really late, because that's what we see here. They're the ones who go to bed the earliest, which I interpret from talking to them and talking to their parents or in-laws that they're not really doing that much work. Maybe that's just them complaining about the work share, but that's their explanation.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but please feel free to join us for coffee afterwards if you have further questions.
Thank you.